Hello, ladies and gentlemen, DPA members listening or watching. This is our scheduled meeting, an opportunity to discuss domestic violence using the case of Osinachi Nwachukwu as an example or illustration. It became necessary to hold this talk because of the intense interest which the society has shown in the case of Osinachi, especially in our forum, the due process advocates, where discussions are raging on the merits of that case and on how we fashion our stand and understanding of that case. It became necessary for me to give this talk in order to help our members understand that case and be able to follow the trial that is ongoing as we speak. Domestic violence is something that we have talked extensively in DPA. We've talked about it extensively in our forum. We have tried over the years and months to gain greater understanding of that subject matter and to analyze the extent to which it poses a problem to our country, Nigeria. Before I go further, let me emphasize that domestic violence has been known to be a major cause of homicide all over the world. Even in the developed countries, domestic violence is a major cause of homicide. In Nigeria, we estimate that the consequences or effects of domestic violence are far deeper and far more entrenched than in other countries where the government and the laws exist to fight or reduce domestic violence. Domestic violence is difficult to describe with precision, but as an idea, we all understand it. It means violence or threat of violence or physical aggression in one's home or between people who are related, husband and wife, lovers, parents and children, and sometimes domestic workers included. Nigeria is a country that has made very little effort to protect victims of domestic violence. For domestic violence to be addressed effectively in any society, a few things must exist. One, there must be a law which clearly criminalizes domestic violence, which says that it is a crime to commit domestic violence and which specifies stiff penalty, including jail term, for anyone that is found guilty of committing that crime. That is the basic. We're supposed to have a law that leaves no doubt in the mind of everybody, every adult, that domestic violence is a crime like any other crime and that one will be punished for engaging in domestic violence. The statutory clarity, that legal clarity, is something lacking in Nigeria. We do not have laws that are specifically targeted at redressing domestic violence. We still try to address domestic violence from the law governing general assault, and that is not adequate. That is not enough. And that's one area where Nigeria is lagging behind. Secondly, we're supposed to have a police force that is trained and equipped to enforce such laws against domestic violence. We're supposed to have police men and women who are trained and who understand that when they witness domestic violence occurring, they should arrest the perpetrator immediately and charge him to court. It's either we have a unit of the police force that is dedicated to domestic violence, or we have police officers that are specifically trained to understand domestic violence, how it occurs, and who are equipped and mandated to enforce that law vigorously. Nigeria does not have that. As we speak today, if Nigerian police officers walk into a scene of domestic violence, they will rather appease the perpetrator or plead with the perpetrator, but will not think of arresting him. If a victim of domestic violence walks into any police station in Nigeria today and reports domestic violence, the police will probably tell her that it's a family matter, that it's a civil matter, and that she should go home. She should go home and manage her home. Again and again, the Nigerian police are not equipped, they are not trained to enforce any law against domestic violence. The failure of the police or the failure of enforcement in the area of domestic violence is another area where Nigeria is lagging terribly behind. Also, we're supposed to have a law that mandates hospitals and doctors and health workers to report any case of domestic violence. In other words, if a victim of domestic violence or somebody that looks like a victim of domestic violence walks into a hospital, the nurses and doctors ought to be mandated to assess the situation, and if they suspect that domestic violence occurred or that the treatment they're about to give or injury they're attending to resulted from domestic violence, they are supposed to call the police instantly, even when the victim denies it. Even when the victim says, no, it was not domestic violence. The nurse or the doctor is supposed to get into a room and make a call to the police and say, we have someone here who seems to have been a victim of domestic violence, even though she denies it. And the police are supposed to come in there immediately, offer protection to the woman, and get to the bottom of it and find the truth and enforce the law. We do not have that. Our doctors and our nurses today will try to stay away from domestic violence cases. Indeed, if a victim mentions domestic violence, the doctors would like to report something else. Also, we have to have a law that makes it punishable for any health worker to fail to document evidence of domestic violence. So if a victim of domestic violence walks into a hospital today in Nigeria, it is likely that the health workers will fail to reflect in their medical report that it is a case of domestic violence. And without such record, it is difficult for the victim of domestic violence or for the prosecutor, the police, to prosecute the perpetrator of domestic violence. Fifthly, we're supposed to have some changes in our evidentiary laws to make it easier for the judges to admit into evidence medical records relating to domestic violence. If we don't have these things, as we don't have them in Nigeria today, the government of Nigeria would have failed to have a measure in place to fight against domestic violence. That is the state we are in Nigeria. Government after government, Minister of Women Affairs after Minister of Women Affairs have failed to put in place a clear legal standard, to formulate a clear policy that will be directed against domestic violence. As a result, most homes today in Nigeria face challenges in the area of domestic violence, and there is nothing to protect the victims. The DPA, the organization I founded, has been working so hard trying to draw awareness to the menace of domestic violence. We've tried to enlist the support of the police and the support of government in the fight against domestic violence. But each time we met brick wall. We met a police force that is resistant, police force that fails to acknowledge the menace of domestic violence, police force that failed to enforce the law. We met repeatedly government officials, policymakers who failed to understand the danger of domestic violence and make effort to redress it or to reduce it. That is where we are. That is where we were when the case of Osinachi Nwachukwu occurred. Osinachi Nwachukwu was a celebrity, someone well liked by everybody. Indeed, as a talented gospel artist, millions of people knew and loved Osinachi Nwachukwu. So when she died untimely on 8th April 2022, there was a massive outcry. Indeed, there was a public hysteria over her death. And immediately after that, the rumors trickled out that Osinachi had been a victim of domestic violence. Various stories had been told. How her husband maltreated her, how her husband Peter Nwachukwu controlled her finances, how her husband Peter Nwachukwu controlled her appointments, her meetings, her social engagements, and even interfered with her career development. These rumors went up like a wildfire. Before you knew it, everybody was outraged against Peter Nwachukwu, including myself. Of course, any story about a man maltreating his wife is repulsive to me, is repulsive to DPA. We all stood up and said no. We urged the immediate arrest and prosecution of Peter Nwachukwu based on the rumor, based on the story we heard. But other things began to happen, which I will call the facts, the stories. But for now, let us say there are things we want out of the case of Osinachi Nwachukwu. We want justice to be done. We want to make sure that whoever killed that woman, if she was killed by a human being, that person will be punished. If she died as a result of domestic violence, whoever caused it should be punished. That is a general position we stand by, and we're not going to change that. We want justice for Osinachi. Certainly. Now, what is it that we don't want? We don't want Osinachi's case to be exploited by Nigerian government. We don't want scapegoatism. We don't want the government of Nigeria to do certain things to give us the impression that they are serious about fighting domestic violence, when in fact they are not. So we don't want this case to become one other thing over which pretenses will overshadow reality. Our fear is that a government that has been nonchalant, a government that has never cared about domestic violence, indeed, a government that had condoned and has been complicitous in domestic violence, we don't want that government to fool us and use the trial of Peter Nwachukwu to cover up their ineptitude. Because, let me tell you something, even if Peter Nwachukwu is tried and convicted today and sentenced to death, that is not the solution we're looking for. That's not what will stop domestic violence in Nigeria. We want measures that will save the lives of millions of women victims of domestic violence. Sentencing Peter Nwachukwu to life imprisonment or to death would not even save one life. It did not save the life of Osinachi. Over the years, if the stories were true, over the years Osinachi suffered violence, but there was no law to protect her. There was no mechanism to protect her. And that is the story of many women. Thousands and millions of women in Nigeria face similar situation. Nothing protects them. We want the government to take steps to protect the millions of women. We don't want the government to allow men to kill their wives and then sentence them to death after the women died. That is the danger we face today. And that is why I urge you to take a very critical look at the story of Osinachi Nwachukwu. When Osinachi died, friends of Osinachi, colleagues, fellow artists, and her own family members told the world that Osinachi was a victim of domestic violence I recall specifically events mentioned. One of them said she was so afraid of her husband, she could not do anything without the man's permission. That she could not have a contract without the man's permission. That the man monitored and controlled her. Some said the man slapped her. Some other things were said, but nobody said he threatened to kill her or that he actually killed her. So there was some kind of jump in logic. If you maltreat your wife and she suddenly died, then you kill her. It is fair to make that assumption, and I did make the assumption as well. Because if there had been, as was said, a history of domestic violence, and she died violently, then whoever has been responsible for the history of maltreatment and abuse must be held responsible. It is fairly logical to think in that direction. But I was shocked when I read about the medical evidence, the autopsy report. The autopsy report, the way I read it, stated that there was no evidence of trauma. In other words, there was no evidence of violence that could have led to the death of Osinachi. I was shocked. I had to read this report several times because I wondered if the report was true. I thought maybe those who wrote the report forged the report. Maybe they fabricated the report. Maybe they did not tell the truth. But then I asked myself, who were those that produced the report? The report was produced by a government hospital, the same hospital where she died. And that was a hospital over which Peter Nwachukwu has no control. In fact, Peter Nwachukwu was in detention when the autopsy was conducted. So he couldn't have influenced the report. But also, something struck me. The doctors who conducted the autopsy were aware of the rumors flying all over the place that Peter Nwachukwu killed his wife. Those doctors read the stories that this man killed his wife even before they started conducting the autopsy. For those doctors to finish the autopsy and still were able to say that no evidence of violence caused her death. For those doctors to say so, it meant that these doctors held strictly to their standard of discipline and were not swayed by the public hysteria, by the outcry, by the rumors and speculations going out there. Indeed, it would have been natural for those doctors to be swayed by the opinion of the public. But they held strictly to the discipline of their profession. And if those doctors could do so, what about us lawyers? Should we not also respect evidence and facts? Or should we just say we cannot resist the outcry in the public? If the doctors could be bold enough to say it as they saw it, we should be bold enough to say it as we say it. So, the story that he did it were coming from friends. But what actually caused the death of this lady? And when we talk of causation in law, we talk about proximate cause. We don't engage in the philosophical unbreakable chain of causation and say, oh yeah, he beat her last year, so he killed him this year, even though we don't know how he killed her this year. He locked her out of the house last year, so he killed her this year, though we don't know how he actually killed her. It is important for us to condemn domestic violence. If there is proof, evidence that Osinachi was subjected to domestic violence, we must condemn it roundly. It is our duty to do so. But we must not jump. We must respect evidence. We must respect facts. We must respect science. We must not fall prey to a government that is inclined to manipulate. We must not fall prey to a government that has interest in dancing to the tune of the masses and pretending that something serious is being done about domestic violence when there is nothing being done. I want you to challenge your lawmakers, challenge your ministers, let them pass a law, challenge the police high command, Let them train and discipline police officers to fight domestic violence. Let them do something that can save the lives of millions of women. Let them not play games. Let them not play politics in an instant case, which in the end will not even protect anyone. It's important to look at this. And now, when we talk about the witnesses, none of those people we have seen seem to have been eyewitnesses. Those vocal on the social media, none of them seem to have been eyewitnesses of these events that narrated. So ultimately, looking at the slew of charges Nigerian government filed against Osinachi, the culpable homicide part of it, that is the death, causing the death part of it, seems to have been dealt with decisively by the autopsy report. That leaves these other allegations of domestic violence in the past. And who are the likely witnesses of these things? The likely witnesses, because evidently Osinachi never documented anywhere that she was a victim of domestic violence. We don't even know, we haven't heard that she ever sent a text message to anybody complaining that she was a victim of domestic violence. That doesn't mean she did not suffer domestic violence. Don't get me wrong. That doesn't mean that Peter did not abuse his wife. No. All I'm saying is that we can't guess it. We must rely on credible evidence. We must rely on the type of evidence that can be admitted in a court of law. We cannot rely on gossip and rumors and stories by the side, as unfortunate as it might be. We cannot rely on those things. Of course, in terms of the details of fights between Peter and his wife, the most likely witnesses will be the children who would have been there, who would have been witnesses. But I am very concerned in the manner certain events have occurred. The children of Nwachukwu seem to have been influenced by people. People have met them, probably unintentionally, but by telling them their father killed their mother. By planting that story in their minds, even before the autopsy report was out, that was capable of influencing those witnesses, those very important witnesses. And by so doing, you have actually done Osinachi this service. Because if these children get called as witnesses in court during this trial, the defense counsel will most likely argue that these witnesses were not independent, that these witnesses have been unduly influenced, and that could be a problem. So invariably, at the very least, the weight the court will attach to the testimony of a witness that appears to have been influenced is never as high as when a witness appears independent and uninfluenced. So, in DPA, the Due Process Advocates Organization, we will resist the temptation. We will resist the temptation to flow with the crowd. We will resist the temptation to be popular. We will resist the temptation to be liked at all costs. Instead, we will insist on the truth. We will insist on logic. We will insist on the due process of law. Indeed, I will tell you this. Jungle justice is not only when a mob puts a tie around the neck of a suspect and sets him on fire. Jungle justice covers all situations where people are willing to sacrifice the law, where people are willing to push the law on the side and do what they like. Any attempt to disregard the law, any attempt to disregard due process in arriving at a conclusion of guilt or innocence is jungle justice. We are against jungle justice, just as we are against domestic violence. DPA will maintain its position in defense of women and victims of domestic violence and in the fight against domestic violence. We will also maintain our position in our fight against jungle justice. We demand that all those involved in the case of Peter Nwachukwu, the case of Osinachi, must follow the law and nothing but the law. However good they think their intentions are, their intentions should never surpass the law. We insist that the government of Nigeria must wake up to the menace of domestic violence. They must understand that domestic violence causes the death of millions of people, women mostly, and children. The government must put in place a robust system of fighting domestic violence. We want to make sure there will be no more Osinachi type of case. We want to make sure that every woman abused will have recourse in law. We will make sure that when there is even the threat of violence, the law and the police will be there to protect people against such threats. We want to make sure that all those who abuse their wives or threaten their wives with violence understand that they're violating the law and that they will face the consequences of such violation. That is what we want. That's what we demand. That's what we stand by. And I urge you, DPA members, never be carried away by sentiments. Never get unduly swayed by the sentiments of the moment. We have a mission, and our mission will take time to put in place. And we shall remain eternally vigilant and watch the government to see if government can put in place the right policies and the right laws and the right institutions to enforce such laws. Thank you so much. We shall return to this subject in due course. May God bless all of you.